QueerJoe. Today is a special episode. I get to introduce you to a new format that I'm going to try out. It's Meet the Designer. I'm particularly excited because the last project that I worked on and my current project that I'm working on are both designed by Jamie McCanless. And so I'm going to take you right to the interview with Jamie. And since the interview is slightly longer than most episodes of Knitting with QueerJoe, I figure we'll keep it to that length at this point and not add a lot of periphery introductions. So let's go to the interview. Welcome, Jamie. Welcome to Knitting with QueerJoe. I'm thrilled to have you here as my first ever Meet the Designer interview. So this is really exciting for me.
Thanks.
Just so you all know, Jamie McCanless has two recently published designs available, and both are uniquely beautiful and very different designs. They're both beautiful in very different ways is what I'm really trying to say. I just finished working on the one, if you read my last blog entry, it was the Crosstalk scarf, and I just started the second one. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. So let's find out a little bit more about Jamie. I'm going to hopefully not shock you, but I'm going to start off with a lightning round. So I hope it's not too early on your side of the country to go through this. Very quick one-word answers or a choice of A or B type of thing. So ready?
Sure.
Great. Pick or throw?
Throw.
Toe up or cuff down?
Cuff down.
Double pointed or magic loop?
Double pointed.
Wood or metal?
Wood.
Set in or raglan?
Raglan.
Crew or V-neck?
Crew.
Fingering or worsted?
Oh, fingering.
Color work or stitch patterning?
Stitch patterns.
Stranded or intarsia?
Ooh, stranded.
Impromptu design on the needles or detailed planning and swatching?
Oh, detailed planning and swatching.
I could have answered that one for you. Okay, just let's go through a little bit of your knitting background. How long have you been knitting and who actually taught you to knit?
I've been knitting again since 2009, and I asked my mother to teach me again. She had taught me when I was a teenager, but it didn't stick.
Gotcha. So your mom actually taught you to knit both times?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Do you have any general philosophies regarding knitting? You know, like Elizabeth Zimmerman, you know, fearless knitter and type of thing. Do you have any personal philosophies regarding your knitting?
I like my knitting to be functional. I mean, there are a lot of patterns I like. I like lace, but I don't wear it. So I like what I knit to be, I don't know, I don't want to say more utilitarian because there's a definite aesthetic to it. But the other thing is that knitters ought to be able to knit what they've got. It's tough to go out and buy yarn, especially for a pattern. And I always like to do something a little new. You know, I'm not taking on, you know, a Capitan every time I cast on, but I do like to do something a little new each time.
Got it, thanks. One of the things I really love about your designs is your aesthetic. It's a very different aesthetic than mine, but I really find it incredibly appealing. That's not just in your knitting designs, but it's also in like your choice of colors and even the layout of your patterns I find like really appealing and attractive. Are there some guiding principles and or some aspects of your background that inform your aesthetic or kind of make that what it is?
Well, for the aesthetic, you know, we're knitting for ourselves and for a lot of other people who aren't necessarily looking for something elaborate or fancy. But that doesn't mean there can't be a fit and finish that still makes a piece of knitting very worthwhile, something you're very invested in. What was the other part of the question?
I was really trying to ask about, is there anything in your background that kind of guided you in terms of how you create
how I approach
yourself when you're, go ahead.
How I approach a design. I'd been a technical writer since the late 90s or mid 90s. And that meant that I was communicating between very technical and non-technical audiences who were nevertheless, you know, potentially very, very smart, very able, but just not experienced in whatever it was I was writing about. So I think I use that when I'm writing a pattern. You're not dealing with ignorant people. but you may be dealing with someone who doesn't read charts or doesn't use instructions, or who's used to receiving information in a different way. So I'm still communicating technical and non-technical information to a wide group of people.
Got it. Yeah, it's funny, from a technical pattern writing perspective, I found your patterns to be really concise and very exact, which doesn't surprise me that you have a technical writing background. Each instruction seems to be like really dense with important instructions. There's not like extraneous stuff all around it. And like when I read a pattern, most other patterns, I can kind of skim it and just glean the pieces that I need. And it's kind of like, oh yeah, they're doing a 1x1 rippy here and there. Oh, this is just one of the standard, ways that they do a mesh stitch background and a lace, or I can kind of glean from it what I need to without reading the whole pattern. I can't do that with your patterns. I find you didn't put anything in there that wasn't necessary. And I'm really unused to that because I'm used to kind of reading a pattern in a really lazy way. And so yours, I can't do that with. Is that something you do consciously because of your technical writing background, or is that just how your patterns come out because that's how you naturally write?
I'm sure part of it is the technical writing background. I feel like if I get chatty or if I take too long to get to the point, that I'm wasting your time. And I don't want to do that. You bought my pattern. You want to knit something. I don't know how much filler you need in the conversation.
Fascinating. So let's talk about the Crosstalk scarf. That's the one I just finished for the viewers who read my last blog entry. Generally, how would you describe the design to someone who's never seen it?
It's all cables. I mean, and I knit it when I was fairly new coming back to knitting, and you take on everything. You want to do everything as a new knitter. And so I wanted to try cabling, and so I just did all cables. So that was kind of the reason for the technique. But also at that point, I couldn't afford to go out and buy a swath of yarn. So I had to work with what I had. And that meant stripes, and that meant figuring out a way to change colors without it appearing in the middle of the cable. And so it just kind of evolved. So that was the first iteration. And when I came back to actually turn this into a pattern I wanted to publish, then I started noticing things I wanted to change, whether the size of the cables were a little floppy, or how the cast on and bind off just as a normal long tail cast on and regular bind off were kind of uninteresting. There's really an evolution. Nothing springs out of my head fully formed.
That's awesome. How would you rate the overall difficulty level of that pattern?
Of Crosstalk? I'd say intermediate, or even advanced beginner. The only thing that a person really needs to be able to do is a full 3/3 cable, slip 3 stitches to the cable needle, knit 3 off the cable needle. So there's nothing terribly complicated about it. Other than that, you have to slip stitches, knit 2 together. Other than that, really, the individual stitches are pretty basic.
I said this before in my last blog entry, but I really did have to trust that what you wrote was exactly what you meant, because that's not always the case with most of the patterns that I read. So, and that was the most challenging piece for me. It was like, wow, this is like, I actually have to read this thing. Okay.
Well, so, I'll say that.
Go ahead.
Even for myself, making sure I was doing the right cable, holding it to the front or the back. If I'm not paying attention, I'll make mistakes in my own designs. So I had to go back and reknit things too.
That's good to know. Thanks. Does make me feel better. One of the things that I know you know about me is that I love to learn something new, like you were saying before, and that's oftentimes what appeals to me in pattern designs. And this pattern is I think you just talked about one or two, but I think it's chock full of new things that that I could potentially learn. I did learn actually in doing it. What are a couple of the design elements that this pattern might introduce to a knitter that they might not have seen, even a long-term knitter like me?
Well, you know, the cast on and bind off are new as far as I can tell. I was looking for a way to cast on and bind off that created tabs, so that when you knit the cables, it would look like these were woven bands. And I couldn't find anything like that anywhere. So I developed my own. And when you cast on, you get this row of separated rectangular tabs, and the first cable row across collapses all that space, and it just looks like these ends of a woven piece are sticking out the end. So I did the same thing on the bind on. And like you said, you have to trust the instructions. I couldn't figure out a way to chart that, but it works. And I would say that's the biggest new thing about Crosstalk.
By the way, I would say there were 4 things that I specifically learned in this pattern that I've never done before. One was the bind off and the cast on, 2 completely different things that have the same effect in essence. It creates this very woven look too. The second thing that it does that I've never seen before is, and you talked a little bit about it before, was how it mixes the 2 different colors of when you're switching from one color to another in the middle of the cable. There is this interlocking aspect of how you did that is unique, and I never could have figured that out, or I never would have taken the time to figure that out like you did. It's not simple, but it's very easy to do once you understand the concept of what's behind it. And I thought that was great. And the other thing I just love about this thing, well, I always like when people don't use the reverse stockinette background in cables, because I think it gives it a really textural, a very tactile feel to it when you have that kind of a rolling hills, sort of like cabling. But you even enhance that more by the treatment you did on the outer edges. The selvage edge treatment that you did on that gives it even more of that softness and roundness. And I thought that was a brilliant way of doing it, especially since you didn't do it everywhere. You only did it on, I can't describe this if people haven't done the pattern, but you only did it on one part of the cabling, which I thought was truly amazing, and incorporated the entire side by doing it that way. It was great.
Yep.
I think that's it on Crosstalk. Great. Let's move on to Hallgrim. I'm very excited about Hallgrim. As are a lot of people. So again, would you just give us your general description of what the Hallgrim scarf is?
First off, I would give credit to Charles Gandy, because it was his Hallgrim hat and mittens that gave me the idea for the scarf. He had that design published in Interweave Knits winter 2012. I think so. So it's been 8 years. And I lived in Wisconsin at the time, so cold weather necessitated warm knits. And I knit a scarf with the cable motif of his hat, and out of alpaca wool, and it was a wonderful winter wear. But it was also a bit of a challenge, because his design cables on every row, and doing this flat meant that I was cabling on both the right side and the wrong side, and cabling by purling through the back loop. You know, I will say that rewriting it as a flat scarf made it easier to knit than trying to just work it on the fly from a hat in the round. So that's why I did it, just as a personal project. But I'm very cognizant of intellectual property rights. So I let Charles know that I had done this, and I sent him an email with photos years ago, and he loved it. So much so that when he came to speak at the Madison Knitters Guild, he asked me to show my scarf, or if it was all right to show my scarf with his work and in his presentation. So, you know, this wouldn't have happened without his kind permission. And recently I was just posting photos of past projects on Instagram and Instagram and Facebook, and people started asking me for a pattern for this. I said, no, I can't, I don't own the rights. And Charles saw that and said, go ahead, be my guest, use the motif. So I have, and it's, like you said, it's getting a lot of attention, and I will, give a lot of credit to Charles for that, for his generosity.
By the way, I fully intend on posting the links to his hat mitten patterns, because I think there are going to be people who will clearly want to do both. And they're both very different patterns because, like you said, the hat is in the round and the mittens are in the round, and doing that very fine cabling motif that he does as part of that design is very different doing it when you're looking at the front piece of it. In fact, I think it's much more difficult to do as a scarf, to tell you the truth, because on the back side, you're not seeing the public side facing piece of your work. And so you really have to read your stitches a lot to know, like if you're doing a cable one forward, you have to know that you're purling into the back of the loop on a purl stitch or whatever, depending on which row you're on and things like that. So I think it's an amazing thing. And we will certainly make sure that hopefully we'll reinvigorate sales for Charles's patterns as well, because I think his design, Charles is an amazing designer, and that one is just an amazing pattern. In fact, it kind of goes into my next question. The visual appeal of this pattern has already garnered an enormous amount of attention. My interest in it wasn't really the learning experience this time. It really was because I wanted to make that scarf. I wanted to make it exactly how I thought it was just phenomenal. But I definitely didn't want to try and recreate all, like a lot of times I'll look at somebody's pattern and I'll say, that's a pretty standard traveling stitch, and I can pretty much do that if I care to. This one I knew I couldn't. I saw both the front and the back of it, and I was like, yes, I probably could have figured it out, and I probably, through long trial and error, I could have figured it out. But there's no way I wanted to, and paying a minor price for hours of work, I was much more than willing to pay for that. But I wasn't sure. Were there other techniques that went into this one as well that people could learn from, other than necessarily cabling on both sides of it or stuff like that? Were there other things that you added into this one? I've just started this one, by the way.
Not a lot for this one. Oh, excellent. Not a lot. For me, like you were saying, I liked the look of it. And I don't know how often people purl through the back loop. It's kind of a bit of a learning curve, not much, but after you knit the scarf, there are thousands of purls through the back loop. You'll have it down. It'll just be another stitch that's natural to you. And the only other thing I would say that's really different is that the cast on of Charles' hat is a tubular cast on, which is wonderful for a hat. It gives you that rolled edge and there's a little bit of thickness to it, but it kind of put a ridge on the of the scarf. So I just did a 1x1 just did a 1x1 ribbed cast on by using a long tail thumb method to knit off my thumb in knits and purls. So that's a little different, but it's not, it's not like the tabbed cast on of Crosstalk.
Understood. Great, thanks. Do you have any tips for someone who would like to make this scarf? Because you don't include, you include what you should do absolutely in your patterns, and it's very clear, and just follow the directions and you will get a beautiful scarf. I'm convinced. I'm already starting to, and you'll see that in my current knitting at the end of the Knitting with QueerJoe episode. But do you have any other tips that you just didn't include because it might have seemed to be like that extraneous stuff that you don't necessarily need to read?
I'd say when I'm doing the cables, and I had to pay attention to this a lot myself, it can be a little difficult for me to read whether it's a knit or a purl on the cable needle. So if I found myself a little confused, I'd start making a mental note of that stitch before I slipped it onto the cable needle.
Especially when it's a cable behind.
So that may be,
Sorry.
yeah, yes. I mean, still you're looking to see whether knit or a purl.
Right.
But you slip it onto that cable needle.
Sorry, go ahead.
And you're trying to make sure the cable needle doesn't flip around. So, more often than not, I'd say, okay, this is a purl. But as I was slipping it onto the cable needle.
I gotcha.
That would be my.
That's a great tip, by the way, because I do have to say there's been a couple times when, especially when I'm doing a cable one behind as part of it, and you do a lot of them, where the stitch is kind of hidden behind the work a little bit. And so you can't really, I literally have to pull my cable needle off to the left a little bit so I can say, oh, is this a purl or a knit stitch? And so great. Yeah, that's a great tip. I like it. I was going to ask you if you could speak a little bit about where the design came from, but you've already done that. And so we'll go on to it. I don't think there's anything more on Hallgrim that I was going to ask. Okay, good. No, there's not. So my pattern history with you so far is the Tisket basket, the Crosstalk scarf, and now Hallgrim. So Jamie, from an online perspective, where can people find you online and get your patterns?
Right now, I'm just selling Ravelry, and you can find them by looking at my name, Jamie McCanless, and I'm sure you'll link to that.
I will do that, yes.
And right now, that's the only platform that has them. And for me, it's just a matter of managing the information I've got out in the world. Trying to handle platforms on different platforms ends up taking more time.
Understood. Especially if there's any revisions and things like that. I'm a huge fan of Ravelry in terms of how they handle revisions, especially for patterns. So that's great. So I think in the last 2 weeks, you published 2 rather complex, rather large patterns. What's next?
I have 2 other designs I need to actually publish. One of them is a cowl that I call Stick Your Neck Out. And, and the other is a simple loop that was designed specifically to show off yarn. So it's not all that technically involved, but it is meant to show off beautiful yarn. So those 2 are, among the half dozen or so that I need to get published. But I've begun designing a shawl that will be called Trembler using Jody Long's Alba yarn. It's alpaca and wool tweed. And I'm excited about that.
I swear, I've just recently come in to see Jody Long a little bit, and he's been around for years. He's been published. He has books published. He has so many pattern designs out there, and now he has his own line of yarn. Now, maybe it's been out there for a year or more. I don't even know, but it's amazing. Like this amazing knitwear designer who most people hardly know, at least in this country. I think he has a much bigger presence overseas, hopefully anyway, because his yarn is just beautiful. I think that's about it. Is there anything you had hoped I'd ask you about that I didn't? Or
not out of the top of my head. I mean, I asked you what we were going to talk about. I'd say that, when you knit something, you ought to love it. It ought to be something that makes you, I don't know, it takes you by the heart. Hallgrim, for example, it just, to me, has a romantic feel. People have said it reminds them of Frank Lloyd Wright, so the Prairie School of Design, or arts and crafts, or even Tolkien, the Lothlorien design. There's just an element to knitting that can make you, in the simplest design, just give you a thrill. And I really think that's something to keep in mind as we all knit.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that's a great way. Thanks, that's fantastic. And thank you for letting the viewers get a little sense about who you are and things like that. I'm hoping tons of people get to see your designs out there. I'm also hopeful to see in the near future that people will be favoriting or queuing your patterns, and certainly buying them and setting up projects of their own as they start to knit these things. I have to tell you, the initial curb appeal of Hallgrim for me was it was astonishing, and so I really liked that one until I actually did Crosstalk, and Crosstalk is so satisfying. There's just a satisfaction in that one, and there's a picture of me I took of me wearing it, and it's probably one of the most liked photos I put out there in Instagram and Facebook for a while now, so I've been really glad for that. Thank you again, Jamie, and if people have any questions for Jamie, please feel free to write them in comments or put them down there, and I'll be glad to pass them on or try to get that information from him. I actually see Jamie quite a bit these days, so thanks again, Jamie.
Thank you.
That was fantastic getting to talk to Jamie today. Now on to current knitting. Current knitting, I'm working, as you may have guessed if you listened to the entire interview, I'm working on the most recent publication by Jamie, which is the Hallgrim scarf. Hallgrim scarf is just a beauty of a design, and I'm really excited about working on it. It's going to take me a little while to get to the place where I finish it, I think, but I'm really looking forward to being able to wear it as the weather starts to get a little cooler here. So that's all for today's episode. I'll try to keep my blathering short for you so that you don't have to extend it any longer than you need to. But please do subscribe if you haven't subscribed to my channel, and also like the video and make any comments, especially if you have questions for Jamie. I'd be more than happy to pass them on. You could also do that through Ravelry if you need to do it. And it was great seeing you again. I'll see you next time at Knitting with QueerJoe. Bye.